The thought of him touching my daughter made my stomach twist. Just minutes before the wedding, I overheard Daniel, the groom, laugh with his friends, calling my daughter a fat pig and bragging about marrying her only for the ranch money. That was the moment I decided he would regret every cruel word. If you're hearing this, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The sound of the church organ echoed through the old stone halls of St. Francis in our small Midwestern town, mingling with the soft chatter of guests dressed in their Sunday best. This was supposed to be the happiest day of Grace's life. My only daughter, my heart, the girl I'd raised on our family ranch with love and sweat. I stood among relatives, smiling, nodding, playing my part as the proud mother, but inside, I was already unraveling. I slipped down a side hallway for air. The stone walls held a cool breeze that smelled faintly of hayfields. That's when I heard it, a low, vulgar laugh from the groom's preparation room. The door was cracked. My feet froze. Daniel's voice came through sharp and mocking. Just thinking about tonight makes me sick, sleeping with that fat pig. Ugh! Laughter exploded from inside. My heart turned to ice. He was talking about Grace. My beautiful, sweet Grace with her dark hair and radiant smile. Another man clapped Daniel on the back. At least you're getting the old woman's fortune. The ranch is worth millions. Daniel's cold chuckle cut deeper than any blade. Yeah, if it weren't for Chestnut Hill, I'd never have looked twice. But I'll play along. A bottle of whiskey, and I'll get through the night. The sound of clinking glasses sealed it. My hands squeezed my rosary until the beads dug into my skin. Rage boiled in me, but reason whispered, "Not here, not yet." I turned away, nearly bumping into a curious guest. Mrs. Guest. "Eleanor, are you all right?" she asked. I forced a smile. "Just a bit tired," and hurried to Grace's room. Inside, the contrast crushed me. Grace sat glowing in her wedding gown, her best friend Sophie fussing with her veil, the makeup artist perfecting every detail. She looked like a bride from a fairy tale, completely unaware that her prince was a viper. My hands shook as I asked everyone but Sophie to leave. I had to tell her. "Grace," I whispered, kneeling beside her. "I heard something." "Daniel, he called you a fat pig. He said he's marrying you for the ranch, not for love." Her eyes widened. The light in them died. "No, Mom, you must have misheard. Daniel loves me. He tells me I'm beautiful." I'd heard that denial before, when she was a little girl and classmates mocked her weight. She always believed people who made her feel wanted. "Grace," I said, gripping her hands. I heard it with my own ears. She burst into tears. Sophie stepped in, placing a protective arm around her. "Eleanor, don't do this now," Sophie said, her voice deceptively soft. "They love each other." "If you ruin this wedding, Grace will never forgive you." My heart pounded. Why was Sophie defending him? I'd trusted her like a second daughter. Grace looked at me through her tears. "Mom, are you just afraid of losing me? Is that why you're saying this?" Her words stabbed deeper than Daniel's insults. "Grace," I whispered, breaking, "everything I've done is for you. All I want is your happiness." But the bells began to ring. The bridesmaids rushed in. Sophie wiped Grace's tears and whispered, "Don't let anyone ruin your day." Grace stood, adjusted her dress, and walked out, not even looking at me. Sophie shot me a cold, triumphant glance before closing the door behind her. The ceremony unfolded like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Grace walked down the aisle on Daniel's arm, glowing, while I sat frozen in the front pew, clutching my rosary. Every step she took toward him felt like a hammer against my chest. When they exchanged vows, I bit my tongue to keep from screaming. The reception took place in the garden behind the old estate, strung with fairy lights. Guests laughed, champagne flowed, and Daniel played the perfect husband, charming everyone, but I watched him with cold, focused eyes. I had heard the truth, and I would not forget it. When I tried to approach Grace, Sophie appeared like a shadow. "Let her enjoy her day," she said sweetly. "Don't make her worry." Her words pushed me aside like I was a stranger. And then came the whispers. Within days, the entire town buzzed with rumors. Eleanor tried to ruin her daughter's wedding out of jealousy. She couldn't let her go. Daniel's cruelty spread like wildfire. Children ran past my ranch shouting, "Fat pig," repeating his words, laughing. He had weaponized my pain. A week later, I visited Grace's new home unannounced. Daniel sat at a desk with a thick stack of papers. Grace was signing them without hesitation. My stomach dropped. "What are you signing?" I asked. Daniel smiled coldly. "Just some business paperwork, Mom." "Nothing for you to worry about." I moved closer. Words like power of attorney, mortgage, and loan guarantees leapt out. My blood ran cold. The Chestnut Hill Ranch, my family's legacy, was on those papers. Grace was handing him the keys to everything without even knowing it. Daniel's phone rang, and he stepped outside. Grace went to the bathroom. My chance. Heart pounding, I photographed every page with my phone. Each click was a shot fired in silence. When she returned, I masked my terror with a gentle smile. Back at the ranch, I emailed the photos to Victor, our family lawyer. His reply was swift. Daniel now had absolute control over the ranch. If his businesses failed, the debt would fall on Grace and me. He was using my family's name as collateral for massive loans. I sat by the window watching the fields at dawn, the same fields my father once walked, teaching me to protect our land. Rage replaced despair. I called Victor again. "I'm not letting him destroy us," I said. Victor agreed. "But don't confront him yet. We need evidence, ironclad proof." The next day, he connected me to Isaac, a retired investigator. I met him in a quiet cafe. I told him everything, the insults, the documents, the betrayal. Isaac listened without a word, then nodded. "Give me a few days." 3 days later, he handed me a sealed envelope. Inside were photos of Daniel with a young, elegant woman, Vanessa, leaving expensive restaurants in Chicago, holding hands, laughing like lovers. Then he handed me a USB. I plugged it in at home. Daniel's voice filled the room, cold and smug. "Grace is easy to fool. Once she signs everything, the ranch will be ours, and her old mother will sign the bankruptcy papers herself." Vanessa laughed. "Putting up with a pig for a fortune is worth it." Their laughter echoed in my office like a cruel symphony. My hands shook, but my mind cleared. This wasn't just betrayal. This was war. Isaac wasn't done. Daniel has a brother, Andrew. He hates Daniel. Daniel scammed him years ago. He could be your key witness. I drove to a dingy bar on the outskirts of town. Andrew sat alone, drinking. His face was lined with bitterness. "I'm Eleanor," I said. "Daniel's mother-in-law. I think he's hurting my daughter like he hurt your family." He gave a bitter laugh. "Did you come to defend him? Leave." I slid the photos and played the recording. As he listened, his hands clenched around the bottle. "That bastard ruined us. My father died from the stress. My mother's still sick." I swore I'd never forgive him. I leaned closer. "Help me stop him. Testify. Not just for my daughter, for your family too." For a long moment, Andrew stared at the table. Then he looked up, his eyes clear and hard. "All right," he said. "I'll help you." I left that bar with the first real weapon in my hands, the truth. Grace didn't come home the night I met Andrew. She texted a photo of takeout cartons with a pink heart emoji, the kind of message meant to reassure me she was fine. I stared at it until the screen dimmed. Fine. That word had done more damage to women than the villains ever could. I forwarded Isaac's photos and audio to Victor, then sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote a list. What we knew, what we could prove, and what Daniel could still do if I misstepped. When the list ended, I flipped the page and wrote one more line. "I will not lose my daughter to a liar." Victor called at sunrise. We filed today. Fraud, breach of trust, and an emergency motion to freeze any transfer of ranch-related assets. Do not tip Daniel off. We move first. His tone carried a steadiness I clung to. He'd also managed to subpoena bank records involving Marco, Daniel's cousin, and a series of loans under shell entities with the ranch name leveraged as the Golden Key. I brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead and waited for the courthouse to open. The judge signed the temporary restraining order by noon. Nothing could be sold, assigned, or pledged against Chestnut Hill until the hearing. I exhaled for the first time in days. Grace texted then, "Mom, Daniel says you're upset. Can we talk later?" I typed and deleted 3 drafts before sending, "Always. Come when you're ready." I didn't tell her about the filing. If she warned Daniel, he'd scramble. He'd always been good at scrambling. That evening, I drove out to the West Orchard to check irrigation lines. The sky was pink and bruised, the kind of dusk that makes everything look softer than it is. I found Grace waiting on the dirt road in a cardigan, eyes rimmed red but determined. "Mom," she said, voice frayed, "Sophie told me you've been making things worse. She says you're trying to turn me against my own husband. She used husband-like armor." I kept my hands to my sides. "Do you believe that?" Grace didn't answer. "He said you were tired, that you're still grieving Dad, that the ranch is too much pressure. He said you'd calm down. I want to trust you. But I also want to trust the person I married." Her breath hitched. "And I hate that this is even a choice." I swallowed the ache. "Come to court. That's all I'll ask. One day, hear the evidence yourself." I held her gaze. "If I'm wrong, I'll apologize on my knees and we'll throw a party on the front lawn. If I'm right, you come home." Grace looked past me at the rows of trees we had planted together, a memory she couldn't dismiss. "One day," she whispered, "then I decide." Victor prepped me for the hearing like a general briefing, a foot soldier. He walked me through exhibits, timelines, and the order of witnesses. Isaac with surveillance logs and the recorded audio, bank custodians tying Vanessa's branch to the paper trail, Andrew with the history of Daniel's betrayals, and finally, me, the mother who'd watched a man turn love into leverage. "Keep it factual," Victor said. "Let the receipts speak. Truth doesn't need fireworks." I nodded, though a part of me simmered for the explosion. The courthouse smelled like old wood and coffee. People packed the benches, the same small-town eyes that had dissected our lives at the market now hungry for a verdict. Daniel walked in with that tailored confidence he wore like a second skin. He smiled at Grace, thumb brushing her knuckles. She flinched almost imperceptibly, but I saw it. Sophie sat on the other side of Grace, whispering, her gaze flicking to me with something like triumph curdling into worry. Vanessa didn't enter the room. She hovered in the hallway until a bailiff asked her to leave. Marco kept his head down, as if the floorboards could forgive him. When the judge called us to order, Victor began with the soft blade of plain truth. He showed the power of attorney pages Grace had signed, highlighted clauses that gave Daniel sweeping control to pledge, mortgage, and even sell ranch assets. Then he layered the shell company loans, the transfers, and the timing around the wedding. Every slide was a stitch tightening the wound closed around Daniel's story. The gallery murmured. The judge asked for quiet. I could feel Grace's confusion from across the aisle, like heat rising from asphalt. Isaac took the stand and laid out a map of Daniel's double life with a detective's economy. He identified dates, places, and photographs. Daniel's hand at Vanessa's waist exiting an expensive Chicago restaurant, Daniel unlocking an apartment leased under company funds, Daniel meeting Marco and a bank officer in a cafe 2 blocks from the branch handling the loans. Victor cued the audio. Daniel's voice filled the room, lazy and cruel. "Grace is easy to fool. Once she signs, the ranch is ours. Her old mother will sign the bankruptcy papers herself." Vanessa laughed, the sound brittle. "A pig for a fortune is worth it." The room lurched, a collective intake of breath. The judge's face hardened. Grace covered her mouth, eyes shattering. Sophie stiffened, color draining from her cheeks. Daniel tried to stand, but his attorney gripped his sleeve. "Your Honor," the man objected, "this is illegally obtained." The judge shook his head. "The foundation is in order. Overruled." Daniel sat, jaw flexing, eyes darting to Grace for any sign of absolution that didn't come. Next came the bank custodian. She authenticated email threads that mentioned expediting signatures due to wedding timeline, and internal notes that flagged the Chestnut brand as strong collateral, despite limited operating cash flow on borrower side. On cross, Daniel's lawyer tried to make it sound like ordinary business. The custodian didn't flinch. It's not ordinary to ignore borrower risk because a bride's family owns valuable land, she said. You could feel the needle pierce the lie. Andrew walked to the stand wearing a clean shirt, shoulders squared against years of grief. He didn't embellish. He told the judge how Daniel had promised returns, taken family savings, and vanished. How their father's stroke followed the loss. How their mother never recovered. At one point, Andrew's voice broke. He cleared his throat, finished the sentence, and lifted his chin like a man refusing to be small anymore. Daniel glared at him with a brother's wounded entitlement. The gavel tapped once. "Control yourself, Mr. Ramirez," the judge warned. Then it was my turn. Victor's questions were gentle. The hallway outside the groom's room, the words I overheard, the moment I told Grace, the look Sophie gave me that didn't feel like friendship. I testified about the day I found the documents, how Grace signed without reading because she trusted a man who said spouses support each other. How I photographed each page, sent them to Victor, and sat awake until dawn listening to the irrigation tick in the orchards and wondering if a lifetime of work could be erased by one pen stroke. "Why did you wait?" Victor asked softly. "Because truth needs proof," I said. "And because, if I turned this into a shouting match, my daughter would only hear the noise." I didn't look at Daniel. I looked at Grace. I wanted her to hear the truth, not my fury. On cross, Daniel's lawyer went for blood. "Mrs. Patience. Eleanor, you admit you've always wanted Grace to remain close to the ranch, yes? Isn't it possible you resented Daniel because he represents change?" I didn't blink. "Change is not the enemy. A liar is." He tried another angle. "You photographed private documents. That's invasive, isn't it?" I answered. "It's protective. The ranch is not just land, it's people. It's wages, mortgages, food on tables. If a man is about to burn a house, you don't ask permission to pull the fire alarm." A few chuckles broke the tension. The judge rapped for order, but I saw the way Grace's shoulders lowered, the first exhale of a woman deciding who had been telling her the truth all along. Closing arguments were swift. Daniel's attorney pleaded messiness, misunderstanding, the ordinary friction of family money and young marriage. Victor stripped his story to the studs, shaming a bride, weaponizing her insecurities, exploiting her trust for signatures, laundering the ranch's reputation into loans, and plotting an exit lined with someone else's wealth. "This isn't a misunderstanding," he said. "It's a plan." The words hovered in the stale air. The judge recessed for lunch. In the hallway, Sophie cornered Grace, voice pitched low and urgent. I moved closer but stayed out of earshot. Grace pulled her hand away. Sophie's eyes flashed, and for the first time, she looked afraid. Vanessa stood near the stairwell in a fitted dress, arms crossed like the ending she'd already written in her head. Daniel tried to approach Grace, but a bailiff stepped between them. He turned to me instead, smile venom sweet. "You think you've won because you can afford a lawyer?" he murmured. "You're old, you'll die, and this place will finally belong to people who know how to use it." "The only thing you've ever used is trust," I said, "and you're bankrupt." He flinched, not from the words but because Grace had heard them. When court resumed, the judge's voice was granite. He found Daniel liable for fraud and breach of trust, issued a permanent injunction protecting the ranch, and referred the matter for criminal prosecution. He set separate proceedings to unwind every loan tied to the forged authority. As for the recordings, he added, they paint a picture of contempt so profound that this court can only conclude the marriage was entered in bad faith. He looked at Grace kindly. "You have options." The gavel fell. The room erupted, not cheers, not yet, but the stunned exhale of a town recalibrating its opinion. Grace stood on trembling legs. She faced Daniel, and for a heartbeat, I saw the girl who wanted to be loved more than she wanted to be safe. Then she inhaled, found her balance, and spoke into the hush. "I'm filing for divorce." Her voice didn't shake. It rang. Daniel lurched forward, words clawing up his throat, but bailiffs were already moving. Marco swore under his breath. Vanessa flicked her gaze toward the exit, bored of the scene now that the fortune had evaporated. She muttered, "I don't date failures," and left the way a flame leaves smoke. Sophie gathered her bag with shaking hands, suddenly very small. Outside, sunlight punched off the courthouse steps. Reporters weren't here. Our town wasn't big enough for that, but everyone who mattered had seen enough. Grace stood beside me, quiet, dazed, purged. "Mom?" she said. "I'm sorry." I shook my head. "You were in love." He weaponized that. "That's not your crime." She leaned into me, a grown woman who needed a place to rest for 1 minute. "I want to go home," she whispered. We drove the long road back to the ranch with the windows cracked, the smell of earth and dew sneaking in like a promise. The next morning, Grace rose before dawn and walked the rows with a clipboard. She asked Foreman Lewis to show her the irrigation schedule, sat with Eva from accounting to reconcile invoices, and called 2 buyers to renegotiate price minimums we'd let slip during the chaos. When a new contract hit her inbox from a North Dakota distributor, she read every line and flagged the buried fee like she'd been doing it for years. At lunch, she laughed, a real, tired, astonished laugh, when a mango split in her hands and splashed her blouse. "I can do this," she said to no one and to everyone. "I can actually do this." I stood in the doorway, unseen, tasting the rare sweetness of pride without fear in it. That week, apologies started collecting like fallen leaves. At the market, a woman who'd repeated the worst rumor squeezed my hand and whispered, "I was wrong." Workers who had kept their heads down stopped me to say, "We never doubted you." I didn't need their words, but I accepted them for what they were. The town's confession, their way of repaying a debt in small coins. I hosted a Sunday picnic under the big sycamore, opened the gates, and let our neighbors wander the rows, taste fruit we'd chilled in metal tubs, and listen to Luis's stories about harvest seasons past. Community isn't an accident, it's a decision you keep making. Sophie left town 2 days later. No note, no goodbye. I watched her little blue sedan disappear at the end of the gravel road and felt the clean ache of something that had to go. Grace said nothing. That silence was its own boundary, the kind that doesn't advertise itself but doesn't move either. On the first quiet evening we'd had in months, Grace sat with me on the porch steps, barefoot, breathing the sweetness that lives between orchards and dusk. "He told me I was beautiful," she said, more as an autopsy than a memory. Then he made me sign away the proof that I was worth anything. "It's like he learned my soft spots and harvested them." She winced at her own metaphor. "I don't want to be that easy to read again." "You won't be," I said. "But you don't have to turn to stone either. We don't punish our hearts for believing. We teach our heads to ask better questions." Grace nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, I'm meeting with Victor to file. And I'm signing up for a wellness program in town, not to make men like me, to like myself." She smiled, small but luminous. "Will you walk the rows with me at sunrise?" I shook my head like I might refuse, just to hear her laugh. "Set the alarm," I said. "We'll beat the sun." Back in my room, I opened the window and let the night in. Somewhere beyond the dark trees, a tractor coughed, then went quiet. I thought of my father walking these same fields, of his hand on my shoulder the day he told me the land was not just inheritance but promise. Protect it, and it'll protect you right back. Maybe revenge isn't a knife. Maybe it's a harvest. Patient, precise, and inevitable when you tend the right things. I turned off the lamp, ready for morning. The first morning after the court ruling felt different. The house was quiet, but not heavy. For months, silence had been the sound of tension, the weight of betrayal pressing against every wall. But now, as sunlight crept through the kitchen window, it felt like silence was finally ours again. The clock ticked softly. A pot of coffee gurgled. Outside, Grace's laughter rang out as she tried to corral two runaway goats near the fence. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. She had moved back into her old room the night after the hearing. No grand speeches, no dramatic declarations, just a duffel bag on the porch and a quiet, "I'm home, Mom." We didn't talk much that night. We didn't need to. She sat at the kitchen table, peeling mangoes like she used to as a teenager, while I cleaned out the cupboards of wedding leftovers. Sometimes, love is rebuilt in the spaces between words. In the weeks that followed, the ranch began to settle into a new rhythm. Grace threw herself into the work with a hunger I hadn't seen since she was a little girl chasing calves through the orchard. She shadowed Luis on irrigation checks, learned to negotiate shipping contracts, and even took over payroll meetings. She was still learning, stumbling sometimes, but she was present. She wasn't hiding behind Daniel's shadow anymore, and every time she spotted a loophole in a deal or asked a question a salesman didn't expect, I saw the woman she was becoming, sharp, kind, and finally hers. The community's attitude shifted too. At the market, the same people who'd whispered about me months earlier now greeted us with warm smiles and quiet apologies. "We were wrong," one woman admitted as she helped me pick through dried chilies. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth had already spoken louder than any defense I could have made. We started hosting open days at the ranch again, something I'd stopped when the rumors spread. Families came with their kids, walking the rows, tasting fruit chilled in galvanized tubs, listening to Luis tell stories about the ranch's history. It wasn't just reputation we were reclaiming, it was trust. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the fields, Grace came out onto the porch with a small envelope in her hands. "This came today," she said. The return address was the county courthouse. Inside was the official decree. Her divorce from Daniel was finalized. She stared at the papers for a long moment, her thumb tracing the seal. "You okay?" I asked. She exhaled slowly. Yeah. Then she ripped the papers cleanly in half and tossed them into the fireplace. We watched the flames curl around the edges until the names, Grace Chestnut Ramirez, blackened and disappeared. "That chapter's over," she whispered. I reached for her hand. "And this one's yours to write." She smiled, a real smile this time. "I've been thinking, Mom. I want to start a new line. Organic products, small batch preserves. People in Chicago loved the samples we sent last year. If we build a brand, we can control pricing, not depend on middlemen." Her voice carried excitement, not fear. "I want Chestnut Hill to grow, not just survive." I couldn't help but laugh. "You sound just like your grandfather." She tilted her head, grinning. "That's the best compliment I've ever gotten." The months rolled on. We filed civil claims to recover the stolen loan funds, froze Daniel's remaining assets, and quietly watched as Vanessa vanished from town and Marco struck a plea deal. Daniel, stripped of his swagger, faced his criminal trial alone. Grace didn't attend. She didn't need to. Justice was already in motion, and her energy was better spent on building, not looking back. I attended only once, to watch him in that orange jumpsuit, shoulders hunched, no entourage, no smirk. He scanned the courtroom for Grace, but she wasn't there. I met his eyes, not with fury, but with something far colder, indifference. Sophie, the so-called best friend, left town shortly after the scandal broke. No one heard from her again. There was no dramatic confrontation, no apologies. Just absence. And honestly, that was enough. Some betrayals don't deserve closure, just distance. One crisp fall morning, Grace woke me up before dawn. "Come on," she whispered, tugging at my arm like she used to when she was a kid wanting to watch meteor showers. We walked down to the edge of the orchard where the mango trees ended and the pastures began. Mist hovered low and the air smelled of earth and possibility. "Look," she said, pointing east. A faint glow lined the horizon. "I used to think this place was a cage," she admitted softly. "Like I was stuck here, waiting for someone to save me. But I see it now. It was never a cage. It was my foundation." Daniel didn't trap me. I just forgot where I came from. I squeezed her hand. And now? She smiled through the mist. Now I remember. That winter, we made our first shipment of branded preserves and organic dried fruit to a Chicago specialty store. By spring, they were reordering double. Grace started posting short videos of ranch life, early morning harvests, behind the scenes of production, recipes from old family cookbooks. People loved it. She wasn't just reclaiming her story, she was broadcasting it. Chestnut Hill's name began to mean something more than land again. It meant resilience. On the anniversary of that disastrous wedding, Grace asked if I wanted to visit St. Francis Church. I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to reopen old wounds. But we went. The organ was silent this time, the pews empty. We stood in the back hallway where I'd first overheard Daniel's cruel words. You know, Grace said, her voice steady, I used to think everything changed here. But it didn't. He changed. We just finally heard him clearly. I nodded. And you chose not to be silenced, she looked at me with quiet strength. Because you didn't give up on me. As we walked back to the car, I glanced over my shoulder at the church one last time, not with pain, with closure. That hallway no longer held his voice, only ours. Only ours. Revenge, I've learned, isn't always about striking back. Sometimes, the sweetest revenge is living well in the ruins someone else tried to create. Watching my daughter thrive, watching the ranch flourish, watching truth rebuild what lies tried to break, that was my justice. If you stayed with me this far, thank you. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, because stories like this, they travel. And if you've ever faced betrayal, remember this, you don't need to match cruelty with cruelty. Sometimes the most powerful strike is standing back up, stronger than they ever expected. Hit that like button, subscribe for more, and keep your heart brave. You never know who